The headline today declares, Tel Aviv surrounded by missiles from multiple directions. Iranian proxies simultaneously attack Israel. What we are witnessing here is not simply a military escalation. It is a textbook example of how empires, alliances, and dependent economies become entangled in the contradictions of global capitalism. To say Tel Aviv is surrounded by missiles is to describe not merely geography, but strategy. Israel, long accustomed to facing threats from Gaza or Lebanon in isolation, now faces the convergence of multiple fronts: the Houthis from Yemen, Hezbollah from Lebanon, militias from Iraq, and perhaps even elements in Syria. All are described as Iranian proxies. But let us pause here. The term proxy itself is revealing. It suggests these groups have no agency of their own, that they are puppets of Tehran. Yet the reality is more complex. Each actor has its own grievances, its own constituencies, its own material interests. Iran provides support, certainly, but it does so because these groups already exist in a context of exploitation, marginalization, and resistance. From Israel's perspective, this is an existential challenge. The state's entire military doctrine has been built on the assumption of superiority, to strike first, to strike hardest, and to deter through overwhelming retaliation. But when missiles come from multiple directions simultaneously, deterrence falters. The cost of intercepting projectiles multiplies. The sense of vulnerability among the civilian population deepens. And most dangerously for Netanyahu, the aura of invincibility that sustains Israel's global brand begins to erode. Let us examine the class dimension. For Israeli elites, the missile threat is paradoxically profitable. Each interception by Iron Dome or David's Sling is not just protection, it is advertisement. Global clients observe, evaluate, and often purchase these technologies. The more Israel is attacked, the more opportunities for its defense industry. For ordinary Israelis, this reality brings no comfort. They endure sleepless nights, disrupted lives, and the psychological toll of perpetual insecurity. In short, the top profits, the bottom pays. For Iran, the coordination of its allies, whether Houthis, Hezbollah, or Iraqi militias, represents a strategy of asymmetry. Tehran cannot match Israel or the United States in conventional military strength, but it can create a web of resistance movements that drain Israeli resources, stretch its defenses, and force it into costly perpetual mobilization. For the working classes in Yemen, Lebanon, or Iraq, this often means living under governments or militias whose legitimacy derives less from economic development than from participation in the axis of resistance. Once again, ordinary people become pawns in a geopolitical game while elites consolidate power. Netanyahu, of course, will frame this as proof of Israel's righteousness and necessity. He will argue that Israel is the last bulwark of democracy in a hostile region, under siege from all sides. And in so doing, he will tighten alliances with Washington, London, and European capitals. Yet here lies another contradiction. As missiles fly into Tel Aviv, protests erupt in Western cities against Israeli actions in Gaza and beyond. Western governments may support Netanyahu, but their populations grow increasingly skeptical. This gap between state policy and public sentiment widens with every missile, every airstrike, every civilian casualty. And let us not ignore the global market dimension. Every escalation threatens shipping lanes, oil routes, and investor confidence. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Strait of Hormuz, the Eastern Mediterranean, all become sites of potential disruption. Energy prices fluctuate, stock markets react, and corporations maneuver to protect profits. Once again, the violence of missiles and drones is not confined to the battlefield. It reverberates through boardrooms, trading floors, and households far from the Middle East. So when we read the headline, Tel Aviv surrounded by missiles, we must see beyond the spectacle. We must recognize the systemic crisis of a world order in which military confrontation becomes the mechanism for managing political weakness, economic dependency, and class contradictions. Israel strikes to survive politically. Iran supports proxies to survive strategically. Proxies attack to survive domestically. And the system as a whole lurches forward, generating instability that is both its fuel and its undoing. When Tel Aviv finds itself targeted from multiple directions, we must understand that the city is not merely a location, it is a symbol. Tel Aviv represents Israel's economic hub, its global face, the very image it projects to the world of modernity, prosperity, and integration into global capitalism. To see missiles raining down upon it is therefore not simply a military act, but an assault on Israel's brand, its claim to normalcy, and its promise of security to investors, tourists, and diaspora supporters alike. Now, why does Iran cultivate these alliances, often described in shorthand as proxies? Because Iran grasps a fundamental principle of asymmetric conflict. You cannot defeat a superior adversary directly, but you can exhaust them, you can sap their confidence, you can bleed their resources. Each group, Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, functions as a pressure point, applying strain on Israel from different directions. Individually, they may not threaten Israel's existence. Collectively, they stretch Israel's defenses, multiply the costs of deterrence, and erode the myth of invulnerability. From Israel's perspective, this is an intolerable situation. For decades, it has depended on overwhelming force and rapid victories to maintain deterrence. To appear vulnerable is to invite more attacks. And so Netanyahu is compelled to strike back, compelled to escalate, compelled to demonstrate that Israel remains dominant. But each escalation carries a price: civilian deaths in Gaza, Lebanon, or Yemen, condemnation from global publics, tension with allies like Qatar, economic disruption at home. Compulsion to retaliate is structural, and yet it is also self-defeating. Here is where the class dimensions sharpen. For the Israeli elite, vulnerability becomes an opportunity. Every Iron Dome interception, every new defense contract, every display of technological prowess enhances their profits. Israel's defense sector markets itself as battle-tested, and there is no better advertisement than real-time footage of successful interceptions over Tel Aviv. Yet ordinary Israelis do not reap these profits. They huddle in shelters, miss days of work, suffer trauma, and bear the rising costs of militarization. Once again, we see the familiar pattern. The top profits, the bottom pays. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Hezbollah frames its attacks as resistance. For its leadership, firing missiles is a way to reaffirm its legitimacy, to silence critics who question its role in domestic politics. But for ordinary Lebanese, already enduring economic collapse, inflation, and shortages, these confrontations bring new risks, new devastations, new rounds of international isolation. The missiles may speak of resistance, but they also deepen misery. The same is true in Iraq and Yemen, where elites consolidate power through confrontation, while civilians pay with insecurity and suffering. And in Iran itself, the stakes are high. By coordinating these attacks, Tehran positions itself as the champion of resistance against Israel and the United States. This bolsters its regional standing strengthens its bargaining position in global negotiations and distracts from domestic discontent over economic hardship and repression. Iranian elites thus benefit from the confrontation, but ordinary Iranians continue to face inflation, unemployment, and the suffocating weight of sanctions. Here again, conflict serves class interests at the top while sacrificing those at the bottom. The global capitalist system is the stage on which all this unfolds. Multinational oil companies monitor every escalation, adjusting prices and contracts. Weapons manufacturers see markets expand as missiles fly. Financial institutions speculate on instability, profiting from volatility. For the ruling classes across nations, instability can be monetized. But for the working classes, instability means precarity, jobs lost, prices rising, futures uncertain. The same conflict that enriches Lockheed Martin and Israeli defense firms impoverishes families from Sana'a to Tel Aviv to Detroit. And let us not forget the ideological dimensions. Western media often frames these assaults as acts of terrorism, while Israeli strikes are framed as defense. Arab media often frames them as legitimate resistance against occupation. Each narrative reflects ownership structures, political alliances, and class interests. Information itself becomes a battlefield where perception is as important as destruction. Qatar's Al Jazeera, Iran's Press TV, Israel's Channel 12, America's CNN, all wage battles of framing, shaping consciousness in ways that serve ruling interests. Now consider the geopolitical implications. If Tel Aviv is surrounded by missiles, then Washington is surrounded by dilemmas. The U.S. cannot abandon Israel without undermining its credibility. Yet it cannot fully support escalation without risking wider regional war that could destabilize oil markets and alienate allies. Europe, dependent on Middle Eastern energy watch, is nervously torn between aligning with Washington and responding to domestic populations outraged by Israeli bombings in Gaza or Lebanon. China and Russia, meanwhile, see opportunities to expand influence, to present themselves as alternative power brokers, to exploit fractures in U.S. dominance. Thus, the missiles over Tel Aviv are not simply weapons, they are signals. They signal the decline of a unipolar order, the rise of multipolar tensions, and the systemic instability of a global system organized around exploitation and competition. Each missile is a message, not only to Israel, but to the world. The old order is failing, and new powers are pressing their advantage. When missiles fly toward Tel Aviv from Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and Gaza simultaneously, we are not looking at random coincidence. This is coordination, intentional or tacit, that demonstrates the growing capacity of Israel's adversaries to act in unison. The perception of being surrounded is devastating for Israel's strategic doctrine. For decades, Israeli leaders promised their citizens that technological superiority, U.S. backing, and preemptive strikes would ensure security. Yet now, the reality of multi-front attacks exposes the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated military power. This perception matters enormously in capitalist terms. Israel has marketed itself globally as a safe haven for investment, a hub of innovation, a startup nation. Investors, entrepreneurs, and tourists were told, here is a state that not only survives, but thrives under pressure. But missiles raining over Tel Aviv challenge that narrative. Every interception may protect lives, but it also signals fragility. And fragility in the capitalist marketplace translates directly into capital flight, hesitancy, and risk premiums. Thus, the Houthis' crude rockets and Hezbollah's volleys resonate far beyond the battlefield. They reverberate through bond markets, real estate speculation, and foreign direct investment. Iran, of course, understands this. By supporting its network of allies, Tehran seeks not only to inflict military pain, but also to undermine Israel's credibility as a secure hub for capital. This is asymmetric warfare in the economic dimension. Iran cannot match Israel in technology or Western alliances, but it can erode Israel's aura of security, which is just as valuable in the global capitalist order. Every missile that reaches Tel Aviv is, in effect, a tax on Israel's global brand. Netanyahu's response is to escalate. He orders retaliatory strikes, mobilizes reserves, and demands more U.S. aid. But escalation also deepens dependency. Israel's survival in this scenario requires billions in U.S. subsidies, munitions replenished by American factories, diplomatic cover in the UN. This dependency exposes Israel as less autonomous than it wishes to appear. A nation that prides itself on self-reliance increasingly relies on external lifelines. The contradiction here is stark. Israel projects dominance, but it survives through dependence. Meanwhile, the social fabric inside Israel strains under the weight of perpetual war. Ordinary families live in shelters, children grow up with trauma, workers lose wages, and small businesses suffer from interruptions. The working class shoulders the costs of militarization. By contrast, defense executives, real estate tycoons, and financial elites often profit. The more missiles intercepted, the more defense contracts secured. The more instability, the more speculative opportunities emerge. War, in capitalist terms, becomes a class project, costly for the many, lucrative for the few. The same pattern holds across the region. In Lebanon, Hezbollah's leadership gains legitimacy as defenders of Palestine, but the Lebanese people, already suffering economic collapse, bear the risks of Israeli retaliation. In Yemen, the Houthis gain symbolic capital as members of the resistance axis, but civilians endure famine, airstrikes, and disease. In Iraq, militias strengthen their position, but workers face unemployment and insecurity. In Iran itself, the ruling elite presents itself as the vanguard of resistance, while sanctions, inflation, and repression crush ordinary citizens. The proxy wars are not just between nations, they are within nations, between ruling classes and ruled populations. And let us examine the ideological front. Israeli media amplifies fear, insisting that the nation is under siege. This fear consolidates support behind Netanyahu, even as his corruption scandals and policy failures erode trust. Arab media amplifies defiance, celebrating resistance as proof that Israel can be challenged. Western media, depending on ownership and political ties, oscillates between emphasizing Israel's right to defend itself and worrying about regional instability. Each media system reflects the interests of its class owners and political patrons, shaping perception in ways that sustain the structures of global capitalism. The United States, caught in the middle, faces profound contradictions. It must reassure Israel of ironclad support while managing relationships with Gulf states wary of escalation. It must contain energy shocks to protect its own economy while its weapons industry profits from resupply. It must appease domestic lobbies aligned with Israel while facing protests on university campuses and in major cities against its policies. This balancing act is not sustainable indefinitely. The missiles over Tel Aviv expose not only Israel's vulnerability, but also America's declining ability to manage contradictions in its empire. Meanwhile, Europe watches nervously, dependent on Middle Eastern gas, especially after cutting ties with Russia. European governments dread disruptions in supply routes. Yet public opinion across Europe increasingly sympathizes with Palestinians and condemns Israeli aggression. Governments side with Washington, populations resist. This split is a microcosm of the broader crisis of democracy under capitalism. Governments serve capital and alliances, while publics demand justice and peace. And China, Russia, and other emerging powers seize the moment. Beijing positions itself as a potential mediator, emphasizing its neutrality and expanding its Belt and Road influence. Moscow presents itself as a counterweight to U.S. dominance, exploiting every fracture in Western alliances. For them, every missile over Tel Aviv is not just a blow to Israel, it is a blow to American hegemony. Thus, the scene of Tel Aviv surrounded by missiles is not local, it is global. It reveals the exhaustion of old strategies, the exposure of contradictions, the persistence of class exploitation, and the unraveling of an order that promised stability but delivers crisis. The Gulf monarchies face a profound dilemma in this moment. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and their neighbors have tied their survival to stability of oil markets, of foreign investment, of U.S. protection. They fear anything that disrupts the flow of capital because their regimes rest on that flow. Yet, on the other hand, the Arab street across the Gulf seethes with anger at Israel's bombing campaigns and cheers the image of Tel Aviv under missile attack. For rulers, the contradiction is sharp: align openly with Israel and alienate your own population, or tolerate escalation and risk economic turmoil. This is not a stable position, and it reveals the inherent fragility of regimes that rest on oil rents and repression rather than legitimacy. Consider Qatar. For years, it has positioned itself as a broker, a mediator, the host of talks. Yet the more Israel finds itself under attack, the harder it becomes for Qatar to maintain that balancing role. Popular pressure pushes Qatar to lean toward the resistance axis, but economic and political dependency on Western capital restrains it. Once again, class interests dominate. Qatar's ruling elite seeks to preserve its global wealth and prestige, while ordinary Qataris see the Palestinian cause as central to Arab dignity. The missiles over Tel Aviv expose this contradiction. For the youth across the Arab world, these attacks are a revelation. A generation raised in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, amid failed revolutions and authoritarian restorations, suddenly sees that Israel, long depicted as untouchable, can be challenged militarily. Whether one supports or condemns such attacks, their symbolic power is undeniable. They disrupt the sense of inevitability, the belief that nothing can change. This is combustible material because it can inspire movements, protests, and demands that regimes cannot easily control. In Israel, too, the youth experience transformation. Young Israelis, born into a society that promised security through strength, now face the reality of sirens and shelters. Their parents told them that Iron Dome and American backing would guarantee safety. But the sight of Tel Aviv surrounded challenges that story. It breeds cynicism, anxiety, and for some, radicalization. And here again, class divides emerge. Wealthier families can leave, relocate, or insulate themselves. Working class youth cannot. They live the full brunt of militarization. In the financial world, the scenario is equally significant. When missiles rain down on Tel Aviv, risk analysts in London, New York, and Singapore take note. Insurance premiums on shipping rise. Investors hedge against energy disruptions. Speculators bet on oil futures. Every missile fired becomes an opportunity for some traders to profit and for consumers to pay. War, in this sense, is commodified, transformed into financial instruments that enrich the few and burden the many. Capitalism turns destruction into speculation, suffering into revenue streams. The derivative markets, in particular, thrive on uncertainty. Banks and hedge funds design products to hedge against Middle East risk. The more volatile the region, the more profitable these products become. Thus, ironically, Tel Aviv under missile threat is not just a political or military crisis. It is a source of financial opportunity for elites who sit thousands of miles away, insulated from the explosions, but enriched by their ripple effects. For Washington, the crisis intensifies. Supporting Israel militarily requires resources, attention, and political capital. Yet every missile fired at Tel Aviv raises the specter of broader war, one that might drag U.S. forces into direct confrontation with Iran or its allies. This is not what Washington desires. After 2 decades of exhausting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. elites want to pivot to China to secure the Indo-Pacific. Yet the Middle East refuses to be quiet. Once again, the contradictions of empire reveal themselves. You cannot withdraw without risking collapse, but you cannot remain without overextension. For Europe, the picture is equally fraught. Leaders in Paris, Berlin, and London repeat mantras about Israel's right to defend itself, but their publics erupt in protest at the images of Palestinian suffering and Israeli aggression. The missiles over Tel Aviv become part of a wider narrative that Europe is complicit in wars that its people increasingly oppose. And as the cost of living rises, partly from disruptions linked to Middle Eastern instability, anger deepens. Here is another contradiction. Elites defend alliance with Israel for strategic reasons, while populations demand justice and peace. China and Russia continue to maneuver. Beijing leverages the situation to expand its role as mediator, offering its Belt and Road partnerships as alternatives to Western dependency. Moscow, though weakened by its war in Ukraine, still gains when the U.S. is distracted. Each missile over Tel Aviv is, for them, a weakening of American focus, a splintering of its credibility. The multipolar world takes shape not only through grand summits, but also through the attrition of U.S. dominance in places like the Middle East. And so we see that Tel Aviv, under multi-directional missile attack, is not only a military story, it is a prism. It refracts the realities of class exploitation, global capitalism, imperial contradictions, and ideological struggles. It shows us how elites profit from instability while the masses endure it. It reveals the limits of military dominance in a world of asymmetric resistance, and it underscores that the very foundations of the post-World War II order are cracking under the weight of their contradictions. And once again, the class divide is obvious. Wealthy entrepreneurs can move operations to New York, Berlin, or Singapore. They have passports, networks, capital, but the rank and file tech workers, engineers, programmers, service staff cannot so easily uproot their lives. They remain under fire, both literally and figuratively. Here too, the elite's flexibility contrasts with the immobility of the working class. Universities also feel the strain. Israel's universities have long been gateways to global partnerships, funding, and prestige. But international boycotts, academic protests, and rising criticism of Israeli policies create headwinds